Next up in the VMware Explore Hub Theater, please welcome Head of Developer Relations at Cockroach Labs, Lisa Marie Namphy.
Hi, everyone. Ooh, that was louder than I thought it was going to be. Hello, everyone here. Hello, everyone on Twitch, which is where I understand that most of you are hanging out. And I really appreciate that. And I want to let you know that Lauren is monitoring the Twitch, so if there are any questions, you can get them asked. Lauren will make sure your voice is heard. Otherwise, you can ask me later at Software Dev Angel on Twitter, SWDEV. Probably I have that somewhere on one of these slides. OK, as I said, I'm Lisa. That's me. Oh. That does say Angel. The L got cut off. I think the slide is getting cropped a little bit. Good to know. Move that over next time. So I'm here to talk about building inclusive developer communities. And the thing about this, and the reason this slide kind of looks like the dog's breakfast, is because it's not just one thing. There's so many different types of communities, obviously different types of developers. And so I want to address, these are 3 areas where I have been very active in pretty much my entire career of architecting developer communities. So the reason there's 3 titles is because one of the communities that I'm super proud of building for the last 10 plus years is an open source community. It is currently one of the largest CNCF communities. It started out many years ago as the first ever OpenStack community, and then morphed into where the users wanted to take the conversation, so it ended up with Docker and Mesosphere and Kubernetes, and then a lot of end user stories. So that is where I've done a lot of my work, kind of out there in upstream open source communities. There's also communities that can come around certain technologies. So, the examples I gave are open source projects that are being contributed to, and maybe your goal is to get upstream contributors. There's also communities that you might build that are around technology concepts, like cloud native, like service mesh, like data on Kubernetes. Another one I'm very involved in. Or a very different and third type of community is something that would be done within a corporation. So right now, I am the head of developer relations at Cockroach Labs. That's the only one of these 3 examples that's ever paid me to do anything in terms of building a community, but that's how it is with open source, right? We believe in it, we know this is what it takes to build great software and technology, and we do it for the love of it. But every once in a while, you actually get a corporation to pay you to do something like architect a developer community. But the goals of these 3 things are incredibly, incredibly different. So I wanted to point that out up front, and I will talk about each one, and I'll try not to get confusing about when I'm talking about what. So, slides this way. Sorry, I've got this here so I can not turn around the whole time. But one of the first questions that I would ask yourself is, why do you want a community? I mean, it became like the new thing on LinkedIn with recruiters. If you had developer advocate or any kind of community or DevRel title, you had 1,000 people contacting you all of a sudden because every corporation decided they needed a developer community. And so one of the first questions that I generally ask is, why? Why do you think you want to build a developer community? Also, what do you mean by that? So let's just be really clear. So what do you want to accomplish with it? Who is going to make up this community that you want to build? And then how are you going to segment it out are some questions that I ask up front. So some examples are you trying to build a community of people who come together around a product? Do you have interests in your corporation that you want upstream contributors to change that open source project the way you want it, and that's why you want to make sure you're hands-on in that community? Or are you trying to improve developer experience? Is the UX or the DX the reason why or why not a customer may or may not choose you? Can you lower the time to value? Can you reduce churn? Those are very specific goals for community. A lot of times it's also just to communicate with a developer audience. Obviously, conferences and mentorships are great ways to do this. And then building a community of advocates is probably the most important thing along with the community of users. You really want the community advocating for itself, because as so many studies show, where do developers decide that they're going to adopt their next bit of software from? It's not marketing literature, it's not salespeople, we know that, right? It's not even going to a company website. It's actually their recommendations from their peers, and oddly, social media plays a large part in that too. So this is where developers, by the way, adopt technology, not buy technology, but this is where developers adopt technology and try things out, and then may or may not join your community, depending. So some of the things that I'm going to cover here today are things that I think are essential for architecting communities. Setting clear goals up front I cannot stress the importance of this enough, and making sure those goals are aligned with your organization. Because whether you're getting paid to do this or not getting paid to do this, and it's just your time that you're using, either way, you want to make sure that whatever your goals are, they are in line with all the way up to your CEO, maybe even the board, depending on how your company is structured. If they're not, you're not going to have budget, you probably won't have a job, and you're certainly not going to get a lot of support when you need to take the time, even if it's on your nights and weekends, because most of the companies I've worked for are startups, or even if they were big companies, they also wanted your nights and weekends, right? So even if you say, I'm architecting these open source communities on my nights and weekends, it's not good enough for a lot of corporations. So you really have to be clear what the goals are, and there are so many awesome goals for doing this that are in line with corporations, but sometimes it's bridging that gap for them and really helping them, make those connections and understand what those goals are. The other thing that I see not happen enough is understanding who your community is. Those thousands of recruiters on LinkedIn that I mentioned that ask me for my opinion, or if I want to talk to their company about building their community. A lot of times I ask them, well, who is your community and what is your goal? And they say, well, we want to win the hearts and minds of every developer. That's not a thing, okay? But I have heard that thing so many times. Win the hearts and minds of every developer? Are you kidding me? No, that doesn't exist. So, if you really think about it, what is there, 27 million developers in the world, give or take? And there's no one developer. There's no, what? So even if you did segment that and figure out who that developer is that you're trying to reach, and if your technology can even appeal to them, even if it's 10% of developers, that's enough. I would even venture to say, especially if you're not doing an open source project that you need half the world to contribute to, if it's just for your own company and your platform, 1% of that is probably enough. Do the math on how many users that is, and if you have a price tag involved, do that math too, and you'll realize that's enough to keep the lights on. So we need to get away from this notion of winning the hearts and minds of every developer. Finish that sentence. Every developer building a mission-critical application. Every developer, what is the next thing? Every full-stack developer. I'll have some examples here of how you can have that conversation with somebody who doesn't understand the scope of that statement. The other thing, and the maybe hardest, is metrics. How and what do you measure? So we're going to talk about that a little bit, and also some unlikely places that you can build community that you might not have thought of. Obviously, I don't have to say this, but I say it because I do have to say it. Empathy. Your community organizers, empathy, empathy, empathy. You are listeners. You are educators. You are building community one person at a time by giving people a place of value, a sense of place, and making sure that they know they're valued as individuals. There's no silver bullet. It takes that. So that's the profile of a really good community architect, in my opinion. Also somebody who's willing to do it for free. Because if you don't do this like you would do it for free, you're probably going to burn out. There's probably going to be a lot of problems you're going to run into. So I look for people who are doing this anyway and have a passion for it, or it's going to be a really, really hard thing. And then, of course, like with everything else, content is key. And we will talk talk about some examples of content. And also, there's a podcast coming up right after that. So if I don't get through all of these topics, I am more than happy to drill down on any of these if you have questions for the lovely crew that is going to be sitting, I'm assuming, right there. So some of the goals that you might want to align with, I don't know if you're familiar with OKRA's, objectives, key results, and actions. This is the way a lot of companies measure these things. So figuring out up front, what are the goals of your community? Are they to grow the product usage if you're trying to get people to adopt your platform? Is it product enhancements because you need that community's voice in order to bring that education back to your product teams? Developer relations sometimes is looked at as the glue across the entire company. Be careful with that one. I'll address that at the end. But really be really clear up front what those goals are and what the results of those goals are going to be. Obviously, you want to reduce churn of developers, by the way, not necessarily of corporations. You probably have a lot of people trying your technology before they ever agree to buy a license if you happen to have like a BSL or something that's not totally open source, or before they contract for support. So, better product roadmaps, how often do your product teams actually talk to the community? So you're going to make sure you get that feedback back. And obviously you want to reduce the cost of acquiring a customer. So how good are your docs? How good are your tutorials? What are the materials out there that you've built in order to onboard your community really successfully? And a lot of it is about branding, of course. A lot of the evangelism is putting your brand on the map. So I mentioned understanding your target is super, super important. I've put a list together of, questions I've had to have with people who are wanting to have that conversation about building community. And if you don't focus on this, you're going to be all over the map. You're not going to know, where your community lives. You're not going to know what technology they also care about, what shows you should be at, what meetup groups you should be at, or starting your own. Maybe your community is getting together around their preferred language. Find out, what's your love language? For me, it's Python. I grew up through the OpenStack world, but it's becoming Go very quickly because, as I mentioned, Cockroach is, along with Kubernetes, the largest Go project. And Go is a really, really cool language, and you can do really cool things for especially cloud native stuff. So follow your community's interests and figure out who they are and what they love, and also what their role is. When you start building a community, especially if it's an open source community, you probably do want developers that are going to contribute upstream. But you also need doc writers, and you also need to make sure that your practitioners and your operators are successful. And then you need to have a way to tell your end user stories. These are things that I haven't seen given enough attention in the early stages of building community, and they end up being afterthoughts, and it ends up being a lot of, like how long did it take to get that CKA program rolling for the certified Kubernetes admins? There's same thing with almost every open source technology I've seen. So there's a lot of that that we want to make sure we think through and get ahead of. And those are very different personas also. So make sure you know who your community is and what they want. And then the hard part, as I mentioned, metrics are really hard. I mean, there's a lot of, you use the term soft skills in building communities, but you have to be able to measure stuff. And you have to be able to tie those metrics back to ROI for the business, or as I mentioned, these goals aren't going to be aligned with your business and you're not going to have funding for your projects in the future. So what is meaningful to you to measure? And this goes back to what are your goals of your community building. Maybe you have a goal, a diversity goal, and you want your community to be 25% more diversified by next year. Maybe you want 30% more upstream contributors. Maybe you need more doc writers. You do, by the way. I'm telling you that right now. You need more doc writers, but write that down and make sure that that is part of what you're measuring and you're tracking to that. And then I would say also, where is your community hanging out? Is it forums? Are they in chat rooms? Discord, Slack? Find out all of that, because there's tools out there like Orbit, like Discourse, that have MAU, DAU scores that you can track your daily active and monthly active users. These things are measurable. It's not something we've traditionally good at when we're like DevRel people and we just want to build cool stuff and hang out with developers and talk about cool tech. You have to measure this stuff. You absolutely have to measure this stuff, or you're not really going to get anywhere. So there's a lot of tools that I'm happy to go down into that more in the next podcast. one of the things that, one of the communities I mentioned earlier, the Data on Kubernetes community, we report out these metrics monthly, and shout out to Bart and Sylvan for their amazing work here. This is a largely online community because we built it over the last 2 years during COVID, and so except for the 2 events that they did as co-located events at KubeCon, all of these meetups have been online, and all of the conferences we've done. And these are some metrics that they reported out just a couple weeks ago. As I said, they report these things out monthly. You know, these are things that they decided are worth tracking and worth reporting on. And I think these are some pretty good things. So shout out to that team. Also, a place that you might not think about as your next early adopters of your technology, or the next place you're building community, is hackathons. I can't stress enough how important hackathons are. And plus, there's just so much great energy, and your students build you cute things like origami cockroaches. Sorry, I didn't realize I'm flipping slides in 2 places. This was at a hackathon we did at, it was BitCamp, University of Maryland, and the students found our little grid pad paper and, you know, started making all this cute origami. And when we came back to our booth, they had all these things that they built. But hackathons are a place where you're going to build a lot of awareness. It's a really low-cost way to get a lot of reach for the next generation. And these students graduate, and go into corporations, and if they love your technology, it's not as long as you think until they're out there, advocating for it. It's a great place for recruiting. We get a lot of our interns from hackathons. It's an incredible place to cultivate developer empathy because you're out there actively listening. You know, they've only got 36 hours or sometimes 24 hours to use your technology to build an awesome application that is going to be judged. That's not a lot of time. And they don't have time to take your courses or to go comb through all of your docs. So they are amazing at giving feedback back that we take back to the product teams. You know, and it's like, hey, this is not one of our customers, but this is somebody who had this rapid fire experience with our technology. And if we could make it a little easier to use, or at least to get started with, or at least for them to find where they're going to get their resources to learn about it, that is just absolutely huge. So the real-time feedback is massive, and you take that back. Our strategy has been, if you sponsor a table, then you have a lot more access. There's always a workshop option, which is great. Mentoring is so key. I'm still have relationships with the students that I mentored over the last couple of years of doing this. So you're really building those relationships. And the way you would measure it is the reach of pretty much everybody that came to the hackathon because your branding is there. And then everybody that turned in an application could be engagement. You know, for 20 applications, maybe they had 4 students working each, so that's 80 right there, and then there's all the applications that didn't get turned in on DevPost. So you have a lot of things you can do. You have workshop attendees, and you can do Twitter things with them, or you can have we have a serverless free product, and we have a challenge where if you spin up a cluster, you get a t-shirt. So there's a lot of things you can do to get engagement while you're on site. And then meetups and hackathons are a great place for swag, but they're also a really great place for, if you happen to run a user group, for reaching out to organizers of conferences and getting free expo passes for your community, or free badges for smaller conferences, or getting speakers to give their first presentation because you're giving them a very safe space to stand on stage and give their first talk. And if you record it, now they have a footprint that they can use on YouTube or wherever when they submit their next talk. So it's a really great tool for community building. And I very much encourage you. And plus, I've got this fidget. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I keep forgetting to flip these slides. The guys backstage are going to kill me. So the CNCF knew I ran a really big user group, and they just gave me these fidget spinners to hand out at every meetup I do for a year. I mean, boxes of them showed up on my front doorstep. They'll do that. The Linux Foundation and other big organizations will do stuff like that if you just ask. So make sure you ask, and ask for things for your community, especially the free conference passes. So that's pretty much, the other thing I said was about content. There's a lot of things you can do to provide really good content for your community. We commissioned a Kubernetes report where we talked to a bunch of end users and also analysts, and that's something that we can offer as a really cool piece of content. What I love to do is make sure that the presentations are amazing, and that they're really valuable information for the community to learn from. And that's, obviously there's like beer and pizza that can happen too, but for me, my thing is content, and if you come to a meetup that I run, I'm going to make sure that the presentation is very apropos. And then one of my last slides, like, what is community building not? And I think this is really important to understand, because a lot of times people think it's gap filling. People confuse the goals with sales and with marketing metrics. And it's not that you're not going to be at the events, because you are, and you're going to be presenting, and you're going to be, building your community there. But you have very different goals than your leads or your cost per lead that your marketing team might be measured by. So keep in mind what community building is and what community building isn't. And that's pretty much my talk. There is one thing that I forgot to do. I want to give VMware a shout out. On the first slide, there's a photo of this is actually the homepage of our Cloud Native Containers user group. And this picture was taken in Promontory C, for those of you that know the Palo Alto VMware building. And they've been so kind to host so many of our meetups over the years, obviously before COVID. Sometimes we'd get 300 people in that room, and they would feed us all with pizza and beer, and they were very kind. And I want to mention this because a lot of people don't think about companies like VMware as being advocates for open source or even helping build open source communities, but they really do, and open source wouldn't survive without companies like VMware. So thank you. I hope they let me use Promontory C again when everything opens back up. It's a fantastic place for a meetup. So thanks, everybody, and I think I'm walking over here. Is that what's happening? Okay. Oh, thank you. If there was any Twitch questions also, Lauren can, same mic? Yeah. Lauren can put them.
Wearing the awkward mic.
Okay.
But there you go.
So I'm talking into this one?
Sure.
Okay.
It's fun. Well, just as a programming note, Alex couldn't make it, but my teammate Deshaun is here. We're having lunch, and he's totally up for it. We're very, very excited. I don't want to say it's better, but it's just as good.
Well, same haircut anyway.
Well said.
I'm jazzed.
Need the hat.
So this will be fun, because the three of us are, in the advocate role on the advocate team. So I'm hoping we should just go way into the corner cases and esoterica and edge things, because that'll be fun. And to that end, as I was watching you talk, and one of the things I think about a lot is, when you're thinking about building community and developer advocacy stuff, what's different about if your community is a public cloud SaaS-based community versus an on-premises community? Because I feel and I ask that because a lot of the tools that I would use for on-premises people, I can't give them a coupon for 10 free hours, right? And so I don't know, it just seems there's other thing. I mean, there's a core thing there, but around the edges, there might be something different considerations that you have.
Okay, but in both of your examples, you're talking about a technology that you're offering. So we're not talking about...
Or it could be, it could, I guess...
Unless you're talking about
the
open cloud, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that would be... the OpenStack community that we built for many years, and then Kubernetes, and I wrote a book on my staunch advocacy for the open cloud. So if that's the type of community versus something proprietary that just one organization is offering, then those are two very different things. That's why I spent the first 5 minutes of this talk talking about how you segment those things out. I think if you have anything that's open source, you're going to want lots of people participating and having a stake in the game. So whose other technology is going to be dependent on this, and and then they're going to help make your community better and help make conferences like this great. So I think who you're partnering with, and it probably is the same if you're running something on premises. Thank you, by the way, for using the correct word, on-prem or on-premises.
That's right.
Not on-premise, unless your cloud has some, I don't know, sketchy morals or something. But I think for for something like that, I mean, that's just kind of an infrastructure problem, right? Are you running your own clouds? Are you running are you in our case, if you want to run it on-prem, do you know how to install a database and how to do all of that yourself.
Right,
if it's in the cloud, then obviously somebody else is doing all of that for you.
Yeah. And I guess, I mean, that's a good whatever, frosting to put on my weird cake of the original question, which is to remove the commercial angle from it. Like, you identified another thing is like, well, what if it's really hard to just get the thing running, right? Like that can be a challenge on its own, because then you're kind of left to be like, slides, right? Like, if you can't have the thing for them people to mess around with.
And then you need whole organizations that develop consulting businesses around, helping people get those things running. I mean, it's not easy. Like the two examples I gave earlier, OpenStack and Kubernetes, that they always used to say you need a PhD for these things. And that Kubernetes report that I mentioned, one of the number one findings was that there's just not enough Kubernetes operators out there. It's not easy enough to use, so you need them.
Right.
And then you've got companies like, you're not a software company, you're like Mercedes-Benz, and you're a car company, and all of a sudden you're trying to like have all these software engineers and build these operators just so you can get this stuff to work. And there's a few cloud-native companies where this stuff does just work across whatever the underlying technology is, whether it's VMware Tanzu or it's OpenShift or it's just vanilla Kubernetes, as we like to call it. That you want to make sure that whatever's on top of it just works. But that's not always as easy to do, which is why there are distributions like VMware Tanzu and stuff that is supposed to make it really, really easy. Which, by the way, is super cool. And if we do a meetup at VMware, that would be VMware Tanzu running Kubernetes on vSphere without partition, without having to. I'm like running out of words now. I've been talking too much. Without spinning up VMs. I mean, it's like really cool technology. I think that would be interesting to do a meetup on.
Yeah, I was like way back in the OpenStack days. I think I worked at Dell at some point there, and I was always thinking like, what we should do is just have like a box that we could like ship out to everyone that's like pre-integrated. I mean, for kind of community-based things where it's just like, here's a cloud in a box, and like I remember.
But it should be a Raspberry Pi.
Yeah. Or like I forget which OpenStack conference it was at, but at some point Martin Mikos was running around with a cloud in a backpack.
Yep.
I think I worked for him at that time. When he was at HP for a hot minute, running our cloud team. That was Paris, I think, if I remember correctly.
Cloud in a backpack. We should work on that.
I've had that. I've done the foundation in a backpack, cluster in a backpack.
There you go.
Got to have it. That's a sales tool. One of the things about the communities is, are you maybe targeting the right community, but the wrong community shows up? For a lot of the Kubernetes communities that I've seen, I want the operators to come. That's who I want paying attention to Kubernetes, and it's the software developers that are showing up.
Or the sales and marketing teams, because they think they can, like, they see the 7,000 members and there's like, ooh, that's a lot of people I could affect. I think that's why I mentioned my last slide, content is the most important thing. I mean, the content that you're showcasing is gonna dictate what brings the people. Some people just want to show up because it's free beer and pizza, and that's fine too. That's all part of, everybody's part of the community, right? But if you keep showcasing really interesting content, and if you're listening to your community, so that second example of the type of community where we're following technology notions, whether it's like around service mesh or cloud native containers is so vague I can put almost anything in there that I want. But it's not specifically, if you have a Kubernetes meetup or a Docker meetup, they're going to want you to be very clearly only talking about like Docker or Kubernetes. So you want to make sure that you're clear with your community, and that also you're doing what your community wants. Because the community will go and find the community where the content is going to be the right place for them. And in the early days, you do want a lot of upstream developers if it's an open source project that you're building, and you do want to recruit and have, like all the parts filled, like the docs and everything. But you need to eventually build those training courses and worry about the operators. I mean, if nobody adopts this technology and uses it, exactly. And then you are going to have the vendors come in, and they're going to support the community. They're even going to pay for it, and they're going to buy the beer and pizza. But you have to be really clear that at like a community meetup, they're there as thought leaders. They're there to help push the technology forward. They're not there to sell and advertise whatever it is that they're building. We all know what their dependency on that community is, but let's make sure that we're all adding value.
One of the things that I've heard a lot here is this growth in developer communities internally. The internal DevRel, the internal community around platform, around software, around the patterns that they're using. Have experienced, thoughts, opinions.
Yeah, so internal meaning like internally in a company, like we're building a social coding movement and we want to change the way our developers do software.
We've got 10,000 engineers and we're trying to get them to adopt new technology. We're moving away from the mainframe towards something like TKG.
Yeah, internally, yeah. Yep. So this is another element of developer relations. And actually it was interesting, one of my last years at HP, that was one of my roles. It was less about upstream stuff, but more about getting our 20,000 software engineers to be on the same page, because why is somebody in Yahoo writing the same code that somebody in Mountain View or Cupertino is writing, and so trying to get a social coding movement or inner sourcing, we called it. GitHub was great with this. Oh my goodness, talk about some longtime community members. So we were rolling out a company-wide GitHub enterprise license. Well, this was not an easy thing to do, because if you think about, especially HP software at the time, it was a conglomeration of lots of different companies that had been acquired. And so some of them used GitHub, some of them were on Perforce. Everybody wants to use their favorite thing that they've always wanted to use. And so trying to get developers to adopt a mindset of, this is another thing, Martin Mikos and as you mentioned earlier, Jerome Labat, some amazing people who had a lot of vision were saying, okay, this is going to be painful for a little while, but it has to happen. It has to happen. And so it has to come from the top. And it was mandated, but we'll give you the tools to learn. We'll, whatever you need to adopt will help you get over the fear of all of a sudden you're saying, wait, did you say open source? Is my stuff going to be out there? No, I said inner source. Social coding movement to make us all a lot more productive. And it kind of seems ridiculous to say this now because we've come so far, but 10 years ago, this was still a fight, a big fight. And also, by the way, you're not going to recruit any cool young developers out of college or wherever if they can't use the tools that they want to use, like the cool, hip, social coding tools. So you just have to bite the bullet and do it if that's a problem in your company. And then just find fun, gamify it. Find fun ways to make adoption of this technology very, very fun.
You touched on one thing that resonated. I saw your slides and I kept on thinking of these internal, inner sourcing, those kind of groups, but as a recruiting tool, right? The communities, the recruiters show up, oh yeah, I want to find a Kubernetes operator, I should go to the Kubernetes meetup. But internally as well, if I'm trying to recruit somebody into my company, isn't that a great tool to use? That's a great way to bring somebody in the door. And say, hey, yeah, come to one of our internal meetups. Yeah. One of our internal meetings. That's where my mind went.
Yeah, meetups are a great way to engage with your community, to meet your community. Lots of people go to meetups when they're looking for a job. And so when I start every meetup, I used to say, hey, who's looking for a job? But then people can be kind of shy about that, especially if they're sitting next to their employer. So now what I say is, who's hiring? Raise your hand and keep it up. And I'm like, okay, if you're looking for a job, look around and see whose hand's up. But it's a really great place to connect people. And then, of course, the hackathons are just sitting duck. They're all looking for a job, a year after.
So another thing is, and I don't know, we'll see if we can put this in more of a community tone, is sometimes there's people in your community and you sort of feel like, I don't want to snatch you up to come work on my team because you're a good part of the community, right? And I don't know, on the other hand, sometimes you're like, hey, you should come over here and help me run this community. And again, like I said, this is a total edge case that comes up, but what kind of runs through your mind when you're thinking about maybe I shouldn't try to poach them from my own community because they're doing better in it than not.
Exactly, it's not an edge case. This is all the time. And so many of us are involved in so many different communities and we are passionate about technology. So, Kelsey is an amazing person, and I saw he did the keynote here yesterday morning, and he comes to mind all the time because do you know how many people have said, why don't you try to recruit Kelsey to, and I'm like, first of all, Kelsey is doing more for us where he is because he likes Cockroach. They came out of Google. There's a lot of synergy there, the founders. He's big in the Go community. So when he says nice things about us, from the platform that he has right now, it's like way more valuable than if we brought him in and we were paying him to say nice things. We actually hired one of our best customers is working internally, and I'm like, no, why did you do that? It was a huge brand name, and he used to speak a lot for us, and they deliver a lot of food to your house. That one, and I love working with him, but I really miss having him advocate for us out in the wild.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I wouldn't even say it's a fine line. I think you want to build your advocates externally more than internally. If they're already out there doing great things for you, then keep everybody out there doing great things for you, and then do great things for them. There's so many programs you can do. Like you can do a little tweet thing, and you can honor your advocate of the month, and they won't even know it's coming. And send them a T-shirt or something, and because you didn't ask them to do that, they're doing it because they believe in your technology. And so, you can give a little love back, and they'll probably really appreciate that. Or give them a talk at, bring them on stage with you at KubeCon, not as one of your customers, but just as an advocate out in your community.
Right.
So that's my approach.
Yeah, so sort of the default position is they'd be better in the community. And like there might be some exceptions where you might want to draw people in. But no, that's a good way of thinking about it, is they're doing more for the overall community in the place that they're at. I mean, I guess also, you should ask them if they believe that's the case, instead of doing that thinking on their behalf. But but it's a good filter to see if you even do anything about it.
If someone wants to come and join you, they'll come and join you.
Yeah, that's a good point as well.
Of course, they'd be more than welcome. I'd rather have that than going to like a competitor.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think that community mindset is like, it's so ingrained in me that I don't even really think about that. It's just like, I do so many things for other communities that I've never been paid to do. And it wouldn't even occur to me that somebody would be like, hey, do you want to work here? I mean, it's kind of funny. I can see Rob over there laughing. It's like there are people that I would love to work with. See, the other thing, too, that I was thinking of when you were saying, and that drives me nuts, is when I was building out our developer relations team at Cockroach, and I'm like, getting input about, you need to hire that person because they have 20,000 Twitter followers. You need to hire that person because they just gave a keynote at this conference. And I actually need to hire the people that are going to roll up their sleeves and do the work.
Yeah.
Like, I don't really just want someone with 20,000 Twitter followers that just wants to stand on stage and then, like, not actually.
You don't want just a broadcaster.
Because it's hard work.
Right.
It's a lot of work, and it's thankless work oftentimes. It really is. And so I would rather, I'm mostly behind the scenes, and I'm fine with it being that way, and I just kind of go to work and get to work.
Yeah. Well, so another thing, I was at a DevOps Days last week, and there were like, I don't know, I think they maxed out their registration at like 500 people or something, which is great. And it made me, I hadn't thought about this for a while, but how do you think about when it comes to like getting to your community or getting to a community at like a giant conference like this versus a small regional one?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I'm not driving at like one is better than the other, but like what are the differences and how you kind of like tactically think about like, what do I do here and how do I do the best thing for the community at these different types of conferences?
So, and that's going to depend on what, again, of those three types of community that we're building. Because if it's a product, like you said, you can walk around with a cloud in your backpack and you have their hat on and do something very specific to the product and get attention.
Yeah.
You could host a meetup or something, which is going to be very different than a customer dinner. But if it's technology that you're trying to get adopted, like we had this open source hero concept when we were trying to get more people like interested in open source, and we did this at scale down in Pasadena, and we were doing the DevOps Days LA. This was a few years back, and we had a guy dressed as a superhero running around. I mean, he looked like straight.
That's pretty amazing.
It was incredible. It was incredible, and he was our open source hero, and just in this blue like unitard thing with a cape, and it was great. And he had so many people to stop and talk to him and ask him questions, and he could invite people to an event we were having that evening and things like that. So that would be it's hard at a conference like this because everything is very regulated. But I think for DevOps Days it's a lot easier because it's which DevOps Days were you at?
It was in Dallas.
Oh, was it a good one?
Yeah.
Did they have 5,000 people show up?
No, 500. I'm sorry, not 5,000.
Okay.
500.
Okay.
Yeah, 5,000 would have been like
Yeah, it was the prize.
for a DevOps stage.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, what it got me thinking is that there are, I don't know, I mean, tell me which adjectives or whatever quantifications you would use here, but I almost feel like for a lot of communities, there are more people who won't go somewhere than there are who would like come to a big conference like this. Hence, going to meetups and other things like that. So like the kind of theory I was developing in my head when I was sitting there, thinking about they have 500 people here, they've had to turn away people, is that it might be a better, I'm putting that in air quotes because footnotes on footnotes about that, but like it might be a more effective way to reach more people in the community to focus on regional things rather than gigantic things, just because people won't travel. I mean, because why would they?
Well, and the fact that those data on Kubernetes stats that I was showing, that was entirely an online community, and that thing has skyrocketed, and just shows you that not only do people not even want to drive down the street, they don't want to get off the couch, right? So we are bringing technology to people, and that's a really important thing to do. When I first started running, when it was the OpenStack user group and then the Kubernetes group, I used to say like, hey, show of hands, who's going to be at Summit? Or show of hands, who's going to be, at KubeCon? And all the hands used to go up. And then every year it was less and less and less and less. And I realized I had a room full of 200 people, and people weren't going to those conferences, and they weren't getting the funding, or they didn't have jobs, and they weren't self-funding it. And also because they weren't upstream contributors. They were coming for the end user stories. They were coming because they were practitioners. It was a different...
I wonder if that's like a dimension on this.
It definitely is. And so what we started doing is kind of like the Rejects conference. We were just bringing, or the talks that got accepted, we were bringing those talks to and luckily we have a very large user group, and people are willing, like Rob has flown in from Texas to present at our user group multiple times. It's worth it, and people appreciate it, but we do try to bring all of that content here so that you don't have to, and we live stream it, and Google Hangout or YouTube, and so we do bring the content to you, whether you're at your couch or if you want to come and have a beer and some pizza, show up.
Yeah, I like that. I'll have to think about the end user versus, the up versus the downstream, and how that kind of changes the community involvement there.
The number of upstream contributors is like less and less, and also getting more distributed. So at one point, like OpenStack is another example, it was largely in Texas or here, or where Rackspace and NASA the original companies were. Same with Kubernetes coming out of Google, or whether it's up in Washington. So you had these pockets, and you could build user groups in Seattle or here in the Bay Area or in Austin or different cities in Texas. It's not like that anymore. It's partially because of the social coding movement. You can really be anywhere, and you can contribute from anywhere. But that makes it harder to get everybody together in a room, and you don't know where everybody always is. So, but if you want to make sure you pack a room, go down to the networking belt, host a meetup at Juniper or at Cisco, or you will have 200 people there, especially if you say something like, plugging the security holes in Kubernetes, or a topic that everybody's like, ooh, I want to, see that. You will get people if you bring the right content to the right places.
To keep going, the idea that coming here, I always say I expect everybody that's coming here to the big conference, the gigantic conference, to take what they've learned back home, to take it to their local communities, to their local regions. So when I look at a community in my neck of the woods, I think that we're there so that they don't have to come, or they can come. So our job is to bring that information there. And we kind of got to do both. And also all the way down to the customer focus, the personal, the sit around the table and let's have those types. I think there's that spectrum, but that's how we're going to reach the most.
Yeah.
And I think speaking of sitting around a table, it's been pleasant sitting around a table. We have our clock at 0 there.
Oh,
yes,
I didn't even notice
which is
that.
fine. It was really great. Like I was opening up with, it's fun to talk shop and compare foggy-headed stuff. So
I just want to encourage more people to be community architects, and you get nice titles like CNCF ambassador because I've run all of those meetups and done what you said. Bring that content back into the communities, and every once in a while a foundation like Linux Foundation will reward you. But it is really rewarding work, even though it's hard work, but it's what it takes. We need more people who are willing to do that work. Communities are not built just from upstream contributors. They are definitely built from community organizers and community architects, a word I borrow from Robin Bergeron.
because you really are doing a lot more than just organizing.
Yeah, well, that's great. Well, thanks again. That
Thank you so
was
much.
really fun.
Thank
And
you.
I think that's the end of our little series here of interviewing people. There's many more things, but with that, we'll see everyone next time. Bye bye.
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 Yeah, that was fun.